I gifted my daughter the family property. I stood at the top of the gravel driveway, staring at the old farmhouse, with my heart pounding in my chest. That home had been in our family for generations, since my great-grandfather laid the first brick with his calloused hands and a dream in his eyes. Every tree, every floorboard, every chipped window pane held a memory, and I had given it away, willingly, lovingly, thinking I was passing on a legacy. What I didn't know was that my son-in-law had already decided to sell it before the ink on the deed was dry. They say betrayal feels like a knife in the back. No, it feels like standing in your childhood home and realizing you're no longer welcome. My name is Judith Langley. I'm 68 years old, widow, mother, grandmother, and for the better part of my life, I've believed that family, real family, meant everything. I was wrong. It all started 2 years ago when I decided to finally retire. The upkeep on the farmhouse was getting to be too much for me. The stairs creaked louder than my knees did, and the garden, oh, how I loved that garden, had begun to grow wild with weeds I could no longer bend down to pull. My daughter, Eliza, had always loved the property. She used to say the house felt like a living, breathing member of our family. So when she and her husband, Darren, announced they were moving back to our small town after living in the city for almost a decade, I thought it was fate. I want my children to grow up where I did, Eliza said one Sunday afternoon, as we sat sipping lemonade on the porch. I want them to climb the same trees, play in the same creek, and feel rooted. I nodded, my eyes stinging with tears. That's every mother's dream, isn't it? To see your legacy carried forward. So I did what I thought was the most loving thing. I gave them the house. Not sold. Gave. No price tag. No demands. Just one document and a single clause that I had buried deep in the paperwork. It was an idea that had come to me late one night, like a whisper from my late husband's memory. A clause that would eventually save everything. But I'll get to that. Back then, I was full of trust. Darren smiled, shaking my hand and calling me Mom, in that overly charming way he always did when he wanted something. I remember thinking, maybe this will be good for all of us. For a little while, it was. The kids moved in, repainted the walls, brought in new furniture, and filled the halls with laughter. I stayed in a smaller cottage, not far from the property, close enough to visit, far enough to give them space. I thought it was the beginning of something beautiful. Then things began to shift. Darren stopped waving when he saw me drive by. Eliza seemed tense, distracted. The kids, my grandkids, suddenly had busy schedules every time I asked to spend the weekend with them. And when I brought over my famous blueberry pie, Darren made a face like I'd handed him a live snake. That's when I started hearing whispers. At the grocery store. At the church bazaar. Did you hear? Darren's thinking of selling the Langley place. I'd laugh it off, of course. He couldn't. He wouldn't. But the whispers grew louder, until one day my neighbor handed me a flyer she picked up from the town bulletin board. There it was. Historic farmhouse property, prime location, move-in ready. Contact Darren Shields, Realty. I froze. My breath caught in my chest like I'd been sucker punched. I stared at the flyer as though it might vanish if I blinked enough times. My daughter's name was nowhere to be seen. Just Darren's bold signature and a phone number. He was selling it. Behind my back, I stormed out of the grocery store. Flyer crumpled in my shaking hand. My first thought was to drive straight to the house and demand answers. But my heart wouldn't stop pounding. Instead, I sat in my car with the engine running, staring blankly at the steering wheel. Tears pooling in my eyes. How could they do this? This wasn't just a house. This was the place where Eliza had taken her first steps, where we'd buried our dog, Baxter, under the maple tree, where my late husband, Robert, had built the front porch with nothing but grit and sweat. This home carried our whole story, and now it was on the market like a common commodity. By the time I got home, I had talked myself into calm. Maybe there was a misunderstanding. Maybe Eliza didn't know. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't as sinister as it looked. But when I called, she didn't pick up. Not that day, not the next. I left 3 voicemails, each more strained than the last. Finally, a week later, she showed up at my cottage with a bottle of wine and a nervous smile. "Hey, Mom." I stood on the porch, arms crossed. "Are you going to tell me what's going on?" I asked. She looked caught off guard, but only for a second. "What do you mean?" I held up the now wrinkled flyer. "This, Darren's selling the house, without telling me, without telling you." She looked away. "He told me not to worry you." "Not to worry me?" My voice cracked. "Eliza, I gave you that house because you said you wanted to raise your children there. You said it meant something." She sighed and rubbed her temples. "It did. It still does. But things have changed. The market's hot right now, and Darren thinks—" I cut her off. "Darren thinks—" My voice dropped cold. "Is this his decision or yours?" Silence. That told me everything I needed to know. "Look," she said, trying to soften. "He got a good offer. From a developer. They want to tear down the house and build a modern duplex. We could use the money. We've got debts, the kids' school." I couldn't listen. My heart was pounding in my ears. "So you're selling our family history to cover credit cards? That's not fair. What's not fair is giving away something sacred, only to watch it treated like scrap wood." She looked like she wanted to say more, but instead, she turned and walked down the steps. "I'll talk to Darren," she muttered, but I knew it was already done. Darren had moved forward. The house was on the market. Offers were coming in. All that was left was to close the deal, unless someone stopped him. And that someone was going to be me. Back when I signed over the house, I'd had the paperwork drawn up by a trusted lawyer, an old friend of my husband's, Charles Morton. He was retired now, lived up in the mountains, but I knew he still kept meticulous records. I called him that night. "Charles," I said, "you remember that deed transfer I asked you to help me with a couple years back?" "Of course I do," he replied, his gravelly voice familiar and comforting. "Langley property, signed and sealed. Why?" "I need a copy," I said, "and I need you to walk me through the clause we added. The one about reselling." He chuckled knowingly. "Ah, that clause. I told you it might come in handy one day." I smiled despite myself. "Well, that day is today." The next afternoon, I drove out to see Charles. He handed me the copy of the deed, his eyebrows raised. "You really think he'll try to sell it without checking the fine print?" I know he already did. The clause, buried in the 5th paragraph of the transfer agreement, was simple but powerful. In the event that the grantee, Eliza, or any cohabitant, including spouses or family, attempts to sell the property within 10 years of transfer, without the express written permission of the grantor, me, the property reverts back to the grantor's ownership. Charles had even registered the clause with the county records office. Legally airtight. All I had to do was enforce it. I waited until the perfect moment, until the "for sale" sign went up in front of the house, until the contractor's truck pulled into the driveway to take measurements, until Darren held a private viewing for an out-of-town couple he thought would be perfect buyers. That's when I struck. I showed up at the house, dressed sharp, holding the original deed and clause, copy like a sword. Darren opened the door and looked at me like I was an unwelcome solicitor. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "I came to stop you from committing fraud," I said, holding the papers up. His face went pale. "What? The house isn't yours to sell, Darren. You didn't read the fine print. You should have. You'd have seen that any attempt to sell it within 10 years, without my consent, means the deed reverts to me." "That's not possible," he snapped. "Oh, but it is." I handed him a copy of the clause. Signed, filed, and already submitted to the county clerk this morning. You wouldn't. I did. And the buyers you're trying to con, they'll be hearing from my lawyer, along with the real estate board, if necessary. Eliza appeared behind him, her eyes wide. "Mom," but I wasn't backing down. "I trusted you," I said, my voice steady but tight. "I gave you something priceless." And he tried to turn it into cash like it was a pawn shop trinket. "This house is more than wood and nails. It's our legacy. And you two nearly sold it to the highest bidder." Darren was fuming. Eliza looked heartbroken. But I didn't flinch. "This sale," I said clearly, "is dead, and I want the keys back. Today." Darren didn't speak. His jaw clenched so tightly, I could hear his teeth grind. He glanced at Eliza like he expected her to fight this for him, to defend him. But for once, she didn't. She just stood there, arms limp at her sides, her face drained of color. I turned to her gently. "I want the keys, honey. I'm not asking. This is still my home." Tears welled up in her eyes. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. But it did, Eliza. And not because of me. Because you let him do what he wanted, without even talking to me." I could see the inner war raging inside her, between guilt and shame, between love and fear. Darren shot her a hard look, one that said, "Don't you dare." But it only made her flinch. "Give her the keys," she whispered, not to me, but to him. "What? Give her the keys?" He scoffed. "Are you kidding me? After everything I've done for this family." "No," she cut him off, her voice surprisingly steady. "After everything she's done." She stepped forward, reached into the little dish by the door, and pulled out the key ring with the big brass house key still on it. Eliza pressed it into my hand. "I'm sorry, Mom." I closed my hand around the key, my throat tight. I didn't say anything right away. I just nodded, because if I opened my mouth, I was afraid I'd cry. The legal side unfolded quickly after that. Charles helped me file the reversion paperwork, and the county confirmed the deed transfer reversal within a week. The sale was blocked officially, and any attempt to proceed would now be considered fraudulent. The for sale sign came down 2 days later. I moved back into the house the next weekend. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. It felt strange at first, walking through rooms that had been rearranged with someone else's vision. There were new paint colors, unfamiliar furniture, a faint scent of cologne I didn't recognize. But under all that, it was still my home, still mine. The attic still creaked the same way when you stepped on the middle board. The back door still stuck when it got humid. The maple tree still rustled like a whisper of the past. I spent hours that week scrubbing, repainting, restoring. It wasn't about aesthetics. It was about reclaiming something sacred. Eliza visited a few times, cautiously. She didn't bring Darren. That told me all I needed to know. The first time she came by, she brought a batch of lemon cookies, just like she used to bake with me when she was little. "I know I messed up," she said quietly as we sat at the kitchen table, "but I really thought he had our best interests at heart." I stirred my tea slowly. "That's what makes it worse. You trusted him more than you trusted me." Her shoulders sank. I've been blind, I guess, or maybe scared. Darren's never liked being told no, and I didn't want to rock the boat. You didn't rock the boat, I said, my tone soft but unwavering. You nearly sank the whole damn ship. She flinched, then nodded. I'm sorry. I know. We sat in silence for a while. Then she looked up, eyes glistening. I miss how things used to be. I met her gaze. Me too. A few weeks passed. Word spread through the community. Some were shocked I'd taken the house back. Others quietly congratulated me. I didn't care what people thought. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was simply protecting what mattered. One afternoon, while I was out planting daffodils along the fence line, Darren showed up. He didn't get out of the car, just sat in his overpriced black SUV, engine idling, staring across the lawn. I didn't approach him. He didn't wave. Eventually, he drove off. That was the last I saw of him. As the season shifted, so did my heart. The rage cooled. The heartbreak began to heal. And in the quiet of my reclaimed home, I found peace. Not just because I'd won, but because I'd stood up. Because I didn't let someone rewrite the legacy my husband and I had built with years of sacrifice, laughter, love, and memory. Because I reminded my daughter that loyalty and love are shown in moments of pressure, not just said in moments of ease. Now, every morning, I sip my tea on the front porch Robert built by hand, watching the sunlight pour through the branches of that old maple tree. Sometimes Eliza comes by with the kids. Sometimes we talk about the future, about how to start fresh, about rebuilding what was nearly lost. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I whisper a quiet thank you to the man I once loved deeply, for the life we built, for the wisdom he left behind, and for that one clause in the deed that saved it all. The daffodils bloomed by the fence in vibrant yellows and soft whites, their delicate petals catching the morning sun like hope reborn. I stood barefoot in the garden one quiet morning, watching a squirrel dart across the yard with a peanut in its mouth, and I realized I no longer felt like a visitor in my own life. This house, this land, it was more than wood and brick and dirt. It was the echo of Sunday dinners, the faint scent of Robert's cologne still lingering on his old flannel shirts in the back closet. It was Eliza's first steps in the hallway, the way her little voice used to echo. "Mama, look!" It was grief and joy and love layered over decades. That was what Darren never understood. You can't slap a price tag on that. And deep down, I think Eliza was starting to see it too. About a month after I moved back in, she came over without the kids. She looked tired, like someone who'd been carrying a weight too long. "I left him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I blinked. "What?" She sat down slowly at the kitchen table, the same spot where she used to do her homework. "I packed a few things, took the kids, and went to Aunt Carla's. He tried to yell, to guilt me, but something in me just snapped. I realized I'd been shrinking myself for years, walking on eggshells. I didn't want the kids to grow up thinking that was normal. I set down the dish towel I'd been holding and sat across from her, heart pounding. "Are you safe?" She nodded. "He didn't hit me, if that's what you're thinking. But the manipulation, the control, it was a slow poison, and I finally realized I was the one letting it keep going." Tears filled her eyes. "You were right, about everything, and I was too proud to admit it until now." I reached for her hand, my own trembling. "I was never trying to be right, Eliza. I just wanted you to see your worth." She let out a shaky laugh, wiping her cheek. "Well, I see it now." The months that followed were the most healing ones we'd had in years. Eliza started therapy, So did the kids. They began visiting more often, playing in the same yard their mother once did, chasing butterflies and climbing trees. We laughed again, really laughed. One Saturday afternoon, we baked together, just like the old days. Flour dusted the counter, and little Charlie sneezed when he got it on his nose. Lila helped me roll out dough for cinnamon rolls, her face lit with joy. Eliza stood across from me, watching it all. Her eyes shimmered. "This is what I want them to remember," she said. "Not chaos, not shouting, just love." Darren, meanwhile, tried to stir the pot from a distance. He sent Eliza guilt-ridden texts, passive-aggressive messages through mutual friends, even a veiled threat about suing for partial ownership of the house. But Charles, ever dependable, shut that down fast. "He has no legal ground," Charles told me after one call. "He never had ownership, never even had permission. If he tries anything else, we'll get a restraining order." Eventually, Darren went quiet. Maybe he realized he'd lost his grip. Maybe he found someone else to manipulate. I didn't care. That chapter was closed. As autumn rolled in, the leaves turned golden and amber. The front porch creaked under new rocking chairs. Ones I picked out with Eliza on a whim one weekend. We painted them ourselves, laughing like old friends rather than mother and daughter, scarred by years of misunderstanding. One evening, she brought over a scrapbook she'd been working on. "I've been piecing together family memories," she said. "The good ones. I want the kids to know where they come from." We flipped through pages, photos of Robert building the back deck, of Eliza at 6 playing in the sprinkler, of me holding her after her first dance recital. Toward the end, she'd tucked in a copy of the original property deed, highlighted right on the reversion clause. Underneath, she'd written in soft ink, "She protected what mattered, so we could remember who we are." I covered my mouth with my hand, emotions crashing like waves. "Eliza," I whispered. She smiled through tears. "I don't want to forget again, Mom." Winter came early that year. We celebrated Christmas at the house. All of us. Eliza, the kids, even my sister Carla. The tree sparkled in the corner like it used to. The fireplace crackled. We drank hot cocoa and played charades until Lila collapsed in a heap of giggles. It wasn't perfect, but it was home again. Later that night, when the house was quiet, I stepped outside into the cold. The stars were sharp and bright against the velvet sky. I looked up and whispered, "We're okay now, Robert." And, for the first time in years, I felt like he was listening. Spring arrived with a softness that felt like a second chance. The trees bloomed in hues of lavender and blush, and the scent of fresh-cut grass mingled with the faint memory of old laughter. Life had taken on a rhythm again, quiet but purposeful, like a familiar hymn played on a well-loved piano. Eliza and the kids began staying over more often, sometimes for entire weekends. They brought sleeping bags, board games, and the kind of joy that once echoed through this house decades ago. And each time they left, the silence that followed didn't feel hollow anymore. It felt whole. One day, Eliza asked if we could plant a garden together. "Something permanent," she said, "that grows every year." So we dug into the soil with our bare hands, planting tomatoes, carrots, and lavender. Charlie was in charge of watering, and Lila insisted on naming every plant. They called the rosemary bush Miss Violet, and right in the center of it all, Eliza planted a small magnolia tree. She chose it carefully, saying it symbolized endurance and dignity. "Just like you, Mom," she said, as she patted down the soil around it. "No matter how people tried to cut you down, you stayed rooted." I had no words, just tears, and a heart fuller than I thought possible. Months passed, and I began handing more of the property responsibilities over to her, slowly, gently, with guidance rather than control. She took them on with care, asking questions, making improvements, and even speaking to Charles about setting up a trust for the kids in case something ever happened to her. She was becoming the kind of woman I always knew she could be, one who protected what mattered. One afternoon, we sat on the porch together, sipping iced tea. The sun was setting, casting the yard in gold. Eliza looked over at me and said, "You know, I used to think this house was just a burden, a place full of expectations I could never live up to. But now, I see it's a gift." She paused. "Not because it's ours, but because of what you preserved, what you fought for. It's where our history lives." I smiled at her, brushing a strand of silver from my eyes. "It's yours now, Eliza. Just promise me one thing." She nodded, attentive. "Promise me you'll keep it a place of peace, of truth, that you'll never let anyone claim more than their share of your light again." She leaned her head on my shoulder, a softness in her voice I hadn't heard since she was a little girl. "I promise." Years later, when my hands grew too tired for gardening and my steps slower than they used to be, I would sit on the porch with a blanket on my knees, listening to the laughter of my grandchildren as they raced through the grass, Eliza cheering them on from the deck. The magnolia tree had grown tall and wide, its white blossoms blooming each spring in elegant clusters. It stood proud and steady in the middle of the garden, much like the home itself, rooted in memory, blossoming in legacy. And sometimes, in the hush of evening, I'd walk past the bookshelf in the living room and run my fingers along the spine of the family deed, still tucked neatly in its place. The reversion clause still highlighted, still intact, not because I needed to protect the property anymore, but because it was a reminder of the day I chose to protect myself and everything I held dear. Eliza eventually added her name to the deed officially after I chose to update it, not out of fear, but out of love, of passing the torch in trust, not necessity. She framed the original clause in the hallway next to an old photo of me and Robert. Below it, in her handwriting, were the words, "She didn't just leave me a house. She left me the courage to stand tall inside it." On my 74th birthday, the whole family gathered. Kids, grandkids, cousins, neighbors. The house overflowed with voices and stories and roasted chicken. Someone brought a guitar, and Lila sang a song she wrote just for me. And as I looked around, surrounded by laughter, stories, and the unmistakable scent of cinnamon rolls baking in the oven, I realized something powerful. I hadn't just reclaimed my home. I had rebuilt my family, one hard-earned boundary, one brave decision, one buried clause at a time. And now, I'd love to hear from you. What would you have done in her shoes? Do you think the husband got what he deserved? Or was it all just a big misunderstanding? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. Your voice matters here, and your stories inspire more than you know. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful real-life tales. Until next time, stay strong, stay soft, and never forget your worth.